Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Congressman Brad Sherman. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me.
Good to be with you.
I do want to set the scene for where we are right now. Just over a week ago, on October 7th, Hamas launched an assault on Israel from the air, land, and sea, the deadliest the country has seen in decades. In response, Israel has bombarded parts of Gaza ahead of an expected ground invasion. So first, what do you make of the Biden administration's response to this crisis unfolding in the Middle East?
I think we see how experienced President Biden is in foreign policy. I think his support for Israel is expressed eloquently, and at the same time, he is reminding Israel to follow the rules of armed conflict, and with a focus on trying to minimize the deaths of Palestinian civilians. So I think Biden is really showing us why we elected him president.
What would you say to people who are scared right now of a full-fledged war escalating in the Middle East? What do you think is the likelihood of that happening?
I think we're doing everything possible to keep Hezbollah out of this. If Iran chooses to get involved, it will be through its agent, Hezbollah, which is located in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah is much more militarily capable than Hamas. Israel is putting forces in the north. I think Biden's sending the aircraft carrier group to the Eastern Mediterranean was critical in making sure that Hezbollah, while they'll talk tough and they may shoot a rocket here or there, ultimately stays out of this conflict.
How do you think this changes the United States' dynamic with Iran? Because the United States hasn't had a diplomatic relationship with Iran since the 80s. So how does this change that?
Well, we can't really send diplomats to Tehran. Last time we did that, they were taken hostage. But we do need to talk to Iran. You talk to your enemies often. And at the same time, we need to have the toughest possible sanctions on Iran, both in response to their support for Hamas and their ongoing nuclear program.
I do want to talk about the chaos and the dysfunction in Congress right now. As you know, Israel is at war. A government shutdown is looming. The House right now doesn't have a speaker. So how does all of this chaos affect Congress supporting Israel?
Well, right now, there's enough money in the pipeline that President Biden can resupply Israel, but we do need to pass supplemental aid for Israel the next week or two. Republicans should reach out, and I know that we're ready to talk to any group of Republicans or any Republican leader about an agreement as to how to run the House in a bipartisan way. Unfortunately, right now, the most hard line and most extreme of all the Republican candidates for Speaker is trying to rally Republican support by saying, vote for me, otherwise we'd have to cut a reasonable deal with Democrats. And unfortunately, so many of the Republicans would rather have their worst possible speaker than to get a good speaker working along with Democrats.
Would you support Democrats joining Republicans to just get a speaker over the finish line, regardless of who it is, even who I think you're describing Jim Jordan right now? So would you support Jim Jordan being speaker, or is that a non-starter for you?
Jim Jordan would be among the worst speakers we could have. The only thing good about it is it's good politics for Democrats, because if he becomes the face of the Republican House of Representatives, while Donald Trump is the face of the Republican Party, I think a lot of people will vote for Democrats. But in terms of providing governance, which is why we're here, Jim Jordan would be a disaster. I think Democrats are ready to be junior partners to any group of Republicans or the Republicans overall in running the House in an efficient and bipartisan way. Unfortunately, no Republican, to my knowledge, has reached out to us on that.
I do want to talk about this speaker fight just a little bit more, because there have been a lot of names floated around. Even one Republican was talking to a reporter and was like, hey, maybe I'd vote for you for speaker. That's kind of where we're at right now. So is there any Republican, maybe a more moderate one, that if that name was brought to the table, you would support?
It's got to be not just the person, but the process, how we staff the Rules Committee. And what's especially important to me is if the Senate passes an appropriations bill necessary to keep the government open, that bill gets an up or down vote on the floor of the House. To me, that Heck, even Jim Jordan would be, with that as a rule, would be an improvement over where we are now. I could see President George W. Bush serving as Speaker of the House. He could come back and and obviously I'm not a real fan of how the Iraq War went, but I would think that any reasonable Republican would be somebody that Democrats could work with if it was part of a system where you didn't have five of the most extreme Republicans blocking important legislation and saying, if you bring that to the floor for a vote, we'll knock you out of your speakership. And that's what happened, actually. Kevin McCarthy brought, finally, after exhausting all the alternatives, a reasonable continuing resolution to provide money to fund the government through November 17th, and they bounced him for that reason. So we've got to have a system where the next speaker is obligated to bring reasonable appropriations bills to the floor. Bills, for example, that have already passed the Senate.
You just said a name that I didn't even know was in the speaker realm, and that was former President George W. Bush. A, is that someone you would support? And B, where are we in this fight? Are we close to a resolution?
Three very important Republican members announced their support for Jim Jordan when they said they wouldn't earlier. And so he does have a bit of momentum, but there were 55 who were against him last week. And so now he's down to 52. He can only afford to lose 3 or 4. As to George W. Bush, I pick him as a traditional Republican who isn't doing anything right now. Mitt Romney also comes to mind, but he's got a Senate seat to fill for a while. And again, it's not the person, it's the program. And if the program is to say that if a bill passes the Senate, we'll get an up or down vote on it in the House, and that would be more important to me than the personality.
I do now want to pivot and talk about how some of your colleagues and lawmakers are discussing the conflict in the Middle East right now. Senator Lindsey Graham said this, quote, "We're in a religious war here. I am with Israel. Do whatever the hell you have to do to defend yourself. Level the place." And Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez really took issue to that statement, and she said this in response, quote, "This is textbook rhetoric of ethnic cleansing that cannot be accepted in any civil society," end quote. "It is an affront to humanity to weaponize this horrific trauma to justify the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians." What do you make of her response, and what do you make of Senator Graham's first statement there?
If I heard you correctly, the senator said flatten the place. I'd strongly disagree with that, and I can understand Ilhan Omar's response to it. The fact is, Israel is not going to ethnically cleanse Gaza. Israel is doing what it can to protect the Palestinian people. When in any other conflict throughout history, has one of the warring sides said, we're going to give you notice of where we're going to come in. We're going to give you time to evacuate people. We didn't do that before we bombed German cities in World War II or in the Vietnam War. And so we didn't tell the French people of Normandy, we're going to be landing. In fact, we did everything possible to make both the Nazis and the French civilians think we were going to land somewhere else. The idea of providing notice, and then as people leave northern Gaza, and keep in mind, Israel has asked them to only move roughly 5-7 miles. People don't realize how short a distance we're talking about here. Then Hamas instructs them to stay where they are. And then there is there's an explosion as some are moving south, and it's I think increasingly likely that an investigation would discover that was a Hamas explosion. Israel wants people to move south. Hamas is trying to terrorize people into staying where they are and acting as human shields. So when it comes to trying to preserve the lives of the Palestinian people, Hamas is doing a terrible job. They initiated this war knowing that there would be thousands of casualties on both sides. They are demanding that their people stay as human shields. Whereas if you compare Israel's effort for the civilians on the other side of the conflict with any other combatant in history, I think we can be very proud of Israel and proud that it has taken steps that will cause Israeli casualties, no doubt. Telling people when you're coming and where you're coming obviously does that. But they're willing to absorb additional military casualties on the Israeli side in order to try to minimize the civilian casualties among the Palestinians. So war is terrible. Those who started this war bear full responsibility for its outcome. Israel can and should and will adhere to the law of armed conflict, and has gone way beyond that. And you just saw fuel trucks going in to Gaza, knowing, as Israel does, that some of that fuel will be used by Hamas. That fuel can be turned into Molotov cocktails. That fuel can allow them to use their motorized weapons. And in spite of knowing that some of that fuel will kill Israelis, Israel let it in because the rest of, some of that fuel will also be used to power generators at the Gaza hospital. So again and again, Israel is willing to absorb additional casualties in order to minimize the deaths of Palestinian civilians. Where else in history can you point to where that has been the case?
I do want to talk about this on a national conversation level as well as international conversation level. What happened in Israel is horrific, point blank, and the vast majority of people, yourself included, I'm assuming based on your last comments, are concerned about innocent Palestinians that are in harm's way in Gaza right now. So what do you think is missing from the national and international conversation when it comes to this conflict?
I think that there have been a few Israeli politicians who have threatened or said that Israel will do things that Israel will not do. And it's so strange because in international affairs, usually a country claims to be better than its actual behavior. This may be one of the few occasions where Israel is working to not to besiege Gaza, but rather to go in and take out Hamas with the minimum possible Palestinian casualties. And yet you can point to this statement or that statement by some mid-level politicians in Israel that paint Israel in a worse light. And they may think that that's to their political advantage, but it confuses people because almost always in international affairs, countries behave worse than their rhetoric. This may be one of the few cases where a country acts better than its rhetoric. So I'm pleased to see that fuel is getting in, and I'll say that there is, under international law, food and water are in one category, and medicine is in that category too. Fuel and electric power are in a very different category, and even that secondary category, Israel is allowing fuel in, knowing again that some of it will be used by armed Hamas terrorists.
You had a moment this weekend. You were on MSNBC and you criticized part of their coverage. You warned, quote, not to take at face value statements by the Gaza Department of Health. Where in this conflict do you think the deficits in the media coverage are?
Well, you see referring to Hamas as militants. They're not militants, they're terrorists. You see people talking about governmental ministries in Gaza as if they're separate and perhaps bureaucratic and civil service. No, those are Hamas agencies like their so-called Ministry of Health. Now, that doesn't mean that everything they say is false, but you should identify it. Hamas propaganda says this is the number of Palestinian casualties, and people will take it with a grain of salt. And I know the press is anxious to get information about what's happening in Gaza, but you can't embrace Hamas sources of that information as if they're likely to be accurate.
Do you think, though, anything's missing from this conversation and this coverage that you would like to see more of?
Um, Basically, and I think it's getting out, but once a war takes place, it's terrible. And I blame the politicians who try to achieve their objectives through unreasonable objectives through violent means. Hamas's objective is to kill or expel from the entire Middle East every Jew who lives in Israel. Once you start with that objective and stick with it again and again, it's very hard not to be responsible for thousands of innocent deaths. What we need to see is a two-state solution, and Hamas makes that so much more difficult, not only by rejecting it, but by this terrible attack on Israel that makes it harder to persuade Israelis that they want to live beside a Palestinian state. But ultimately, there are two peoples in the land. There need to be two countries. And the sooner we get there, and with all the security guarantees that Israel needs, and all the disarmaments and all of the law enforcement that's necessary to protect Israel from terrorists, the sooner we get there, the sooner there'll be at least a movement towards substantial peace in the Middle East.
How far are we from a two-state solution or any sort of substantial peace right now? Because within the past week, we have seen violence of epic proportions. It seems like we are the furthest away from peace we could possibly be. So how do you think we get there?
Well, first we take out Hamas. Hamas took this action perhaps in desperation because they saw that President Biden was close to putting together a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, we identify Saudi Arabia as perhaps the most important Arab country because it's got the most oil. It is also perhaps the most important Muslim country because the Saudis are the guardians of the holy places, Mecca and Medina. And that stature, if they cut a deal with Israel, means that the Arab states have accepted that there will be an Israeli state. And that is the number one thing Hamas is trying to prevent. They knew when they started this that thousands of them would die. And yet they took this action because they were so desperate to avoid that. They also know that by killing thousands of Israeli civilians, they certainly put back for many years, or at least several years, the day when Israel can agree to an independent Palestinian state, because obviously there's a lot of anger in Israel. There should be. It's one thing to face a military attack on your military from your opponents. It's another thing to see them rounding up old ladies and taking them back as hostages. Killing old women who were survivors of the Holocaust, decapitating people, the rapes. This is not something that makes it politically palatable in Israel to talk about a Palestinian state.
As you know, Senator Mitt Romney was part of a bipartisan group of lawmakers to go to Israel over the past weekend, and he said that every life lost is at the hands of Hamas. Do you think this is a sentiment that is shared by many Democratic voters, or the majority of Democratic voters?
I think the vast majority of people in America recognize that the lives that are lost are because Hamas entered into started this war, and started it with an attack aimed almost exclusively at civilians. I think on reflection, they'll realize it's not just Hamas's actions of the last 10 days. It's Hamas demanding that every Jew in the Middle East be killed or expelled, that has set the Middle East up for the tensions that we've grown up with decade after decade. So yes, this war is because of Hamas. If Hamas had not engaged in this brutal mass terrorism, this war would not be happening. And Hamas must take responsibility not only for every dead Israeli, but every dead Palestinian as well.
And Congressman, my final question to you is, these are just the beginning days right now. The initial attack, Hamas's attack on Israel, was just over a week ago. What should Americans be looking out for next?
Well, at best, this is a 2-month conflict that will have the world's attention, that will at least put a premium on whether oil will be available, because it could get larger and involve more. There could be actions by the United States to prevent Iranian oil from reaching world markets. There could be terrorist actions against other oil facilities. We need to make sure that Hezbollah stays out of this battle. And I think President Biden's actions accomplish a lot of that, and the Israeli government's actions accomplish a lot of that. But Israel can't live next to the Hamas monster in the future. They're going to have to go in and really eliminate Hamas as a terrorist government living right next door and dedicated to as I say, the killing of every Jew or the expulsion of every Jew from the Middle East.
Congressman Brad Sherman, thank you so much for your insight. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Thank you very much.